This short documentary series on the humanities in Europe today, which starts from Europe but will expand to cover, I hope, the whole world, is the initiative of the European network of humanities centers and institutes. We decided collectively with our colleagues that it would be a good idea to present a series of portraits of leading figures in the humanities in our part of the world, and to use them as sources of inspirations, as role models, if you wish, for practitioners and students alike. The portraits of these very sort of charismatic, highly accomplished, distinguished professionals accomplishes another aim. It allows us to trace a genealogical sort of portrait of where the humanities have been, where they are at today, and where they could go, insofar as each person that we interview is asked to trace their own itinerary, past, present, and future. And simply by asking a question like, what was your faculty called when you studied as an undergraduate? And noticing the semantic, the institutional, the political transformations that the field has gone through. Just by doing that, I think the viewers should be in a position to measure the extent of the changes and the extent of the vitality of the field. The hope of this mini-series is indeed that we can collectively, as practitioners but also as spectators, express our love for, our trust in, our respect for this amazing field of the humanities at a time in its history when it is coming under attack in the press, in the public debate, in policy making and financial decisions that are really penalizing this field. The humanities in the 21st century, as you will see in the different portraits of these great figures we're offering to you, are a vital, vibrant, critical, creative, extremely accountable field, proud of its history, confident of its place in the world, and very hopeful for the future. We really hope that you will enjoy watching these great figures, and maybe you will be yourself tempted to run out and interview somebody that you know in your own neighborhood, in your own circles, because the humanities are everywhere and for everybody.
You need also not only to be multidisciplinary in your own way of thinking, or perhaps interdisciplinary, but you need to be able to work in multidisciplinary teams, and that means respecting the way that other people set research questions, what they think the problem is. Because finding the answer to things is one kind of challenge in life, but the biggest challenge really is knowing what the right question is. Well, when I first went to university, I studied archaeology and anthropology at the University of Durham. But I don't recall thinking very much about faculties, whether I was a humanities person or a social sciences person or an arts person. I was more fascinated by the difference between archaeology and anthropology. And of course at Durham we didn't just do social and cultural anthropology, but we also did physical anthropology. So I did lots of genetics. And actually I've always been very interested in science. And as my career has sort of developed, I've had more or less to do with science, depending on where I've been and what I've been doing. But actually that connection to science has always been a very important part of the way I think about humanities, because these are very different ways of framing and understanding the world. And they have different kinds of purchase and different contexts. And I think it's a great shame that many people who are brilliant in the humanities know often very little about developments in modern science. And I've always been very interested in that. But the course at Durham was meant to be very broad, intentionally. And I think when I came to the end of it, I wasn't thinking, again, too much about what kind of person I was, more about what I wanted to do. And it's that doing that's a very important part of the way I think about myself. And so when I finished the course at Durham, what I wanted to do was to go and work, first of all, in Cambridge, partly because at that time, in Cambridge, archaeology and anthropology were still together. All the wars that were to separate them were to come later. And I think that in a way, archaeology was always a really strange and bifurcated discipline. It thought it was a humanities discipline on the one hand and a science discipline on the other. And that division was a productive one, even if it sometimes blew up whole departments and faculties. And the anthropologists, well, they were busy trying to say, well, you know, we're really into people, and it's what people think and what people do, and we know about that. And all the people you archaeologists are interested in are dead. So that's really your major problem in life. All your people are dead. Whereas we have people we can ask questions about. But then, of course, all my work in anthropology was also about things that humanities scholars really care about. So it was about narratives, it was about identities, it was about telling particular stories, participating in rituals, it was about myth, it was about ways in which very beautiful objects can be used to reformulate and reframe people's relation to the world. And so I think there's, for me, never really been a terribly big division between the social sciences and the humanities. And I've always had one ear somehow listening for new developments in science. And I think it was difficult when I was first an academic, because the kind of science that was going on in the biological sciences was so restrictive. You remember that world. We actually lived through a world, before we understood what epigenetics was about, we lived through a world where people thought there was something called the gay gene. They actually believed in it. And they kept thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars were spent on trying to prove this completely imaginary notion. And I think it's that kind of thing that where you couldn't really have a sensible conversation. You know, you were having conversations with people based on, say, E.O. Wilson's work on ants. So were humans like ants, or were they not like ants? You know, were ants social in the same way that humans were social, or were they social in a different kind of way? You know, what was the social? These kinds of conversations were intensely frustrating and couldn't really go anywhere with sort of sociobiology as it was then. But I think now one of the difficulties is that lots of scholars haven't caught up with the really exciting things that are going on in the biological and life sciences. And actually biology has certainly caught up with the humanities, and now indeed frames some of its questions in ways that connect through to the kinds of questions that interest humanities scholars. In the history of my career, people have always tried very hard to label me. This was very much the case when I did my PhD. It was very much the case after, when I first got my first jobs. People wanted to say, yes, you see, you're not really a social anthropologist, you're probably really an archaeologist. And I was very puzzled by this, because my orientation is towards questions, problems, so either philosophical questions or practical empirical problems. And I think in the area of gender, though, that kind of crossover between empiricism and philosophy is enormously important, and it's what sustains the inquiry into gender. So you can't leave aside all the work on the symbolic construction of gender. That's impossible. That's really what all gender is about. But on the other hand, neither can you leave to the side the empirical work that needs to be done. So how much are women paid? What jobs do they work in? How many of them are politicians? How many of them are airline pilots? All those kinds of questions that we've wrestled with for years, you know. As we all know, in a sense, the analysis of gender has often come down to who takes the rubbish out, you know, in what kind of family and why. And in those kinds of situations, you have to be attuned to the politics that comes from that kind of empirical work. But you can't do good politics or good empirical work without doing that conceptual work. And that conceptual work is very much inspired by work that was done in the humanities. And I think one of the things that, for many feminist scholars like me, is that it's the feminist perspective that prevents you from cutting off other people and other people's perspectives, from saying, oh yes, you know, I only do one thing, I don't do this thing, I do that thing, at the expense of something else, right? I think it's very difficult to be a good feminist scholar if you're not attentive to the way that other people want to frame problems and the way they want to think about it. And it's particularly important because actually when you talk to people outside the academy about gender, the responses you usually get are either, well, this is all obvious, we all already know it, or, you know, I disagree with you because I've got a gender and what you said doesn't correspond to my way of thinking about it, right? And so that kind of response from people already tells you that you have to maintain that tension between the philosophical perspectives and the empirical work. Well, another moment of change in my life. So I'm just about to begin working at University College London in the Faculty of the Built Environment. And that means that I'm moving from the Department of Anthropology in the University of Cambridge, where I've been the chair of anthropology, to a situation where I'm now going to be the chair of culture, philosophy and design. And that, I think, just about says it all, right? It shows that this trajectory of moving has always been about, in a way, what I'm working on, what's important at the time. And of course, for many years, I mean, I have been defining myself and have been defined by others as a social anthropologist, although many people who read what I write are not really even aware that I'm really a social anthropologist, not really. Although some of them take a different kind of view. Some of them think, well, this is a kind of feminism that is a feminism of social anthropology, and so therefore its philosophical basis is quite narrow. So people come at different angles. I think it's the old problem. People want to label you all the time, and the question is, how useful is that label? Now, in terms of anthropology, what it's meant is that I have never been, as far as the discipline is concerned, a canonical anthropologist. Because the canon is not one of those things that I'm a great supporter of. My work tends to work obliquely to the canon. In fact, the canon for me is a kind of jumping off point. It's better to think about the canon providing some kind of sort of pathway or a bridge over a river or something with many different roads leading off it. And the idea is that you get off it as soon as you can and go and do something more interesting, right? So, I mean, that's what the canon does. It alerts you to the fact that you probably shouldn't be working on that. But it also alerts you to the fact that you have to be absolutely fluent in it. And this is a problem for people who are genuinely multidisciplinary in the work that they do. I think when we're thinking about contemporary humanities, all the questions that the humanities address are the ones that are on the most urgent list. If you had a kind of World Wildlife Fund view of humans, right? So the question is, what are we going to do about cultural hatred? What do we plan to do about migration? What's the quality of the housing that people are living in? How good is their education? What it is that they actually know? Can they understand contemporary science? Do they know how to share with people? Any of these questions. Do they know what the relationship to inquiry in the world is? Does it matter whether truth is relative? Any of these questions. If you asked any of them, these are all on the top of the extinction list, pretty much, in human societies. You know, we're living at a time now where we thought that we passed out of the 20th century as the great century of conflict and war. We find ourselves at the beginning of what was going to be the great century of hope, the 21st century, and conflicts around the world are already multiplying, and multiplying in ways which are more brutal. And why are they brutal? They're brutal because people cannot imagine what it's like to be other. They cannot imagine what the life of other people is like, and therefore they can't imagine or empathize or sympathize with the fact that other people may think differently from them. And this kind of lack of attention to the other, which is actually a failure in self, is I think, one of the kinds of central questions of the humanities, and it spins out into everything. So not only is it there in the question of what does history tell us about the present, in there about how we create narratives in literature and so on, but it's also there in economics, is what are we going to do about growing social inequality? Do we plan to do anything about social justice? And if not, why not? And actually it's very easy now to live in societies with enormous differences in wealth. But the people who earn at the top earn such enormous multiples of what people at the bottom earn. And what's the basis of that? The basis of that is an inability to understand how to value properly what we call the economic in social and moral life. And because we can't do that, we can't sort out lots and lots of other kinds of problems. So for me, the humanities perspective is absolutely crucial. You know, I have a close friend of mine who said, imagine, you know, what exactly is an oil company? So you think an oil company is, you know, a bunch of people who go drilling holes in ground with pieces of engineering. He said, no. You know, an oil company is about law. It's about political science, right? It's about how you treat your workers, right? It's about, you know, what do you think moral responsibility is? It's about, you know, what do you give back to people when you've taken things from them, you know, even with their consent. In other words, It's about how do you formulate ideas about management, for example. It's about how to manage people. All of those questions are actually humanities questions in one way and another. It might be quite an interesting think piece to imagine what the world would look like if humanities scholars were actually running oil companies, right? And it's an interesting idea because one of the things we've lost sight of is a certain degree of humanitarianism. So, for example, in the most recent conflict that's been going on between Israel and Gaza, we were all shocked to find that there were young Israelis sitting up on the mountains looking at the shelling of Gaza down below, sitting there in the evenings on sofas, on chairs, having a party and cheering when the rockets landed. Now, in order to do that, in order to cheer when your own country is actually shelling other people, you must have lost some kind of connection to understanding what the misery is of that for others. And I think that it's those kinds of questions. There is a kind of failure of the humanitarian, which for me must be part of humanities, because it must be part of who am I for myself and who am I for others. And that's actually the core of many things. It's also the core of storytelling. It's the core of philosophy. It's the core, I think, of even really of economics. And it's the failure of economics to understand that that question is at the core of it. A kind of familiarity, which ought to be about what are the structures of social relations that bind us together, and why do they bind us in particular ways. It accounts for lots of the difficulties we're in right now.
Thank you.